What's up, Bears fans? Welcome to the Next Wave Ball podcast. Today, I have a special guest, Usaid, Bears writer. We're just going to talk about a little bit of what happened at Rookie Minicamp and tying into OTA. So, how are you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Thanks again for having me on here.
Yeah, absolutely. So you weren't at Palace Hall during Rookie Minicamp, but you are pretty much plugged in. My first opening question to you is, what are the general vibes around Caleb Williams specifically, as far as being that touted as, the type of high status quarterback that we've never seen before?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, the general vibes are this is that everybody's finally speaking the same language at Hallis Hall when it comes to
Mm.
developing the quarterback. And that to me is so significant because we've kind of seen what's happened with the last two quarterbacks. It seems like this third one, well, the team president, Kevin Warren, is certainly on board saying, hey, we're not just going to go ahead and we're not just going to give up on a guy because after a year or two, because that guy's not working out. It's more so, hey, we know what it takes to have success in the NFL. And quite frankly, we're going to go out and do whatever we need to make it happen. You look at where Caleb Williams is at, and I will say this, from everybody I've talked to, people that were at minicamp, I couldn't make it because minicamp just fell this year on the weirdest weekend where it was Mother's Day and my mom's birthday back to back. So I had to kind of pick and choose. But you start to look at the whole thing. And I think, Caleb Williams has just been so eager to kind of dive into everything. And, you talk about him embracing the kind of non-football aspect of it, embracing the city. Well, the football aspect of it, I mean, he's dove into it real well. He has had really close conversations with Shane Waldren, who was actually at his introductory press conference during draft weekend. And then you look at this thing from the Bears perspective and you kind of go ahead and say, okay, Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus are like, well, look, tell us what you need. We will figure out a way to give it to you. You've got Shane Waldron, who is kind of figuring out what type of offense he wants to build around Caleb Williams in terms of, what Caleb's strengths and weaknesses are now that he is in the NFL. And then you just look at, I think, the general vibes. Everything just seems to be on the trend upward. So it's, been really positive so far.
Yeah, and that's a great point you brought up as far as Shane Waldron still figuring things out, because even us fans, we love the amount of weapons that we have around Caleb, but there's only one football, and you can only throw to one person per play. So Shane has to figure out, how everybody gels together. So as far as Rome Odunze, what's the vibes around him? I guess my question is, where do you feel like the Bears want to slot him in? Because he's in such a rare predicament where on most teams that picked in the top 15, I want to say, besides the Vikings, who already have Justin Jefferson, and the Raiders, who already have Devontae Adams, the majority of the teams he would have been drafted to, he would have been wide receiver one, or at least, fighting for wide receiver one. And now he comes to Chicago and he already has two proven veterans over top of him. So just kind of give me your general thoughts on Rome Odunze going into his rookie year.
Yeah, for Rome, he's a guy that, I mean, to nobody's surprise, is extremely competitive. And then when I say extremely competitive, I mean, I think Bears fans are going to see, will put a new definition as to into what it means to be competitive. And, the reason I say that is this is because Rome's very just kind of having been around him for a couple of days now, getting a chance to talk to him, during the introductory pressers. Rome is very socially aware of what is going on around him, and Rome really understands. And he said in the press conference, he's like, listen, I get the fact that there are two veterans ahead of me, and I respect the hell out of that. But also, and again, I'm paraphrasing here and just alluding to what he said, he also said that, look, DJ Moore and Keenan Allen have a very specific skill set that they're going to bring to the table. I'm going to do whatever I can in my power to kind of add to that, but also really bring something unique, which to me, just, when you kind of tie it back into what is this offense going to look like with Shane Waldron? What is this offense going to look like with Caleb Williams at the helm? How about three really good receivers plus Cole Kmet? I mean, I think the reality of it is that Rome to me should be a lot like a Devontae Adams in a sense, where he can certainly be a Devontae Adams type receiver. But what's going to make him significant is he's that big guy that's, whatever, 6'3", 6'4", that you can kind of, have him line up outside the numbers. You can move him inside the slot. You can play
Yeah.
him a little bit closer to the line of scrimmage. And so it's really just, one of those big things that you look at and you kind of start to say, okay, there is a high level of versatility that Rome's going to bring. Like, it's unrealistic to expect on every single play the 3 receiver sets, but the Bears, in terms of their personnel groupings with their wide receivers, they can go 10 personnel. They can certainly go 11 personnel too if they wanted to. I think when you talk about Shane Waldren and this wide receiver room, he's gonna have to figure out how to balance a guy like Rome Odunze's skill set with those 10, 11, 12 personnel looks that you should be seeing quite frequently.
Yeah, and kind of going back to where Shane Waldron came from, the Seattle Seahawks drafted a Jackson Smith-Njigba who was a first-round wide receiver coming into a similar situation where he had 2 guys over him, and there was the whole pre-draft process where he kind of seemed like he held his tongue when asked about Shane Waldron because, he wanted more looks, and that was kind of a concern, a small concern, not a big concern that I might have had for Rome, is that are we maximizing Rome's ability or are we just fitting him in with the rest of the offense? But that just kind of ties into my question. A lot of people kind of just assume that Shane Waldron worked with the Geno Smith who had 4,000 yards. He was he has experience as a coordinator as opposed to a Luke Getsy. But as far as the entire NFL world, Shane Waldron doesn't slot in as an immediate elite offensive coordinator, right? Shane Waldron has to prove that just as much as the players have to prove their talent. So how like, I guess among you and your peers and your colleagues, what's the general vibe of Shane Waldron and the confidence level that he is going to be maybe a long-term offensive coordinator, at least, and if you do good at offensive coordinator, eventually he'll get a head coaching job. But yeah, just kind of touch on that.
Yeah, Shane is, and again, we've only spoken and heard from him a couple times, but Shane is kind of this curious case of what are you getting, right? Because everybody wants to look at, and again, the people in the media room at Hallis Hall, everyone's going to kind of look at the work that he did in Seattle and say, okay, it's really favorable what he did helping Geno Smith get turned around. But I also think that, it's unrealistic to sit here. And again, we hear all the time about the NFL being a copycat league. Shane Waldron, the biggest mistake he can make is trying to take the situation in Seattle and fully replicating it here. And now, why is that a mistake? It's a big mistake simply because, when you kind of look at it, right, everyone's come to the consensus that he's going to have to build this thing out from scratch. And yes, there are parallels. Like, you've got, a pretty good running game. You've got 3 really good receivers. You have some solid tight ends. But I also think that, at the end of the day, the big defining factor is the quarterback position. When you look back at Shane Waldron's tenure here in Chicago, the question's really going to be, and I'm not saying he's getting fired after, 1 or 2 years, but the big question is going to be, what did he do to help Caleb Williams? That's ultimately how he's going to be remembered. So I look at Shane and I say, he's a guy that certainly knows and understands how to, call an offense, scheme guys open, how the offense tends to evolve when they're on different parts of the field. Because the big thing is this is, your offense, right? You're never going to try out the same plays, the same formation, the same personnel when you're in the minus territory, which is your own territory, compared to when you get to plus territory, right? When you look at Shane Waldron, I mean, there's a very clear pattern here with his play calling that once he gets to, I want to say, the 30 to the 40-yard line, and it's his own 30 or 40-yard line, he does tend to be a little bit more aggressive because, again, you're, have a chance there with 1 or 2 explosive plays to go ahead and really score. So I think, with Shane, the big thing is he certainly knows what he's talking about. The experience he had in Seattle, the experience he had working in LA with Sean McVay certainly benefits him because that kind of gave him, 2 very different perspectives there to be able to kind of bring here to Chicago.
Yeah, it's one of those cases where it's like the past 2 offensive coordinators, we weren't really sure what their experience was. And at least it is relieving that Shane does have years of experience doing it. So pivoting a little bit, this is more specific to you. what are your biggest takeaways that you got? It'll be a double question. What are your biggest takeaways that you got from rookie minicamp, and what are you specifically keeping or keeping an eye out most for moving into OTAs?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that Tory Taylor being 6'4", wearing number 19, he certainly looks like a wide receiver. All right. Could probably, even if the Bears were willing to polish him up enough and develop him, play a Taysom Hill type role, because he is freaking jacked. Let me
Uh,
just say that for the record. So, Tory Taylor's real big, but you look at some of the other big kind of takeaways that I have, and I really think, and I had this conversation with someone today. I think when you get to training camp in about another 2 months here, the edge rusher 2 job, there's a serious argument to be made that it's Austin Booker's to lose at this point. Because at that spot, yeah, well, you have Dominique Robinson. He really hasn't done much. He, quite frankly, should be a cut candidate this year.
oh
Yeah,
yeah,
yes, you got DeMarcus Walker, but then again, I think there's also the argument to be made. Okay, well, do you trot out Montez Sweat and DeMarcus Walker week 1, but then as the season goes along, kind of give Austin Booker more and more reps just to make him fully comfortable? And then you talk about some things that I'm keeping an eye on, the second half of the question. No more kind of figuring out. I know I talked about it earlier, but what exactly is Shane Waldren going to do with these 3 wide receivers? Because the Bears are this unique team where, 10 personnel, because you have 1 running back, 0 tight ends, and 3 receivers. You could see a lot of, 10 personnel sets to be able to stretch the defense horizontally and vertically. And then you get over to 11 personnel and you're looking at, okay, well, 1 running back, a tight end, and then you do have your 3 receivers as well. So in terms of, the 11 personnel looks, what specifically are you getting out of it there? Well, I think, you're going to see a lot of 11 and 12 personnel looks. 12 personnel simply because you went ahead and you signed Gerald Everett to a big deal, who's shown, or to a pretty solid deal, who's shown to be a solid, hybrid tight end that can kind of block, but also get out into open space and certainly be able to go ahead and pass catch if needed. But you talk about 11 and 12 personnel. I mean, when it comes to the passing game is always kind of scripted and made into triangles. And I really wish I had a telestrator or a whiteboard here so I could show you guys. But the big thing with the passing game is this: you're going to have 3 guys on 3 separate parts of the field, but those 3 routes are going to be connected in a sense of you should technically be able to draw a triangle between the 3 routes. And so really just understanding and knowing that the triangles in the passing game, and it's a fundamental thing at any level of football, but Shane Waldron, he should be able to create those triangles to be able to get those guys out in space. Now, those things are going to, in terms of how Caleb Williams is reading and progressing in the offense, is going to be key to monitor too. Because if your first read, which is a deep shot, let's say, depending on where you're at on the field, isn't open, well, then you go to the next leg of the triangle. And your next leg, if you look at it, okay, if that's open, then you go ahead and Caleb Williams is going to be expected to hit that. If he doesn't hit that next leg, well, then he's going to have to go to the third leg, which, I know a lot of people might say, okay, well, Caleb Williams is going to end up being a check down king because he's just thumping the ball off. Yeah. Sometimes your plays are just designed to be that. And quite frankly, as an offense, you will take whatever a 4, 5, 6 yard pass, even though it's a nice little dump off, because it at least is, building some level of momentum. And the other thing I'm looking at is this. The last thing here is you talk about the defensive side of the football. Well, I look at this defensive line group and I say, hey, that 3 tech position and the 1 tech position, what's going to go on the interior there? You've got Andrew Billings and you have Javon Dexter. Zach Pickens, can he take another step in his development? Do you look at the secondary and kind of say, okay, how's Kevin Byard going to play alongside a guy like Jaquan Brisker? Do the Bears maybe even change things up and go more cover 1 this year with Kevin Byard, knowing how rangy he is? So it's just, a variety of things where on paper, this roster is talented, but also the big thing is realistically, they still got a lot of stuff to sort out.
Yeah. And as far as like the depth, Ryan Poles even said it in one of his press conferences around the draft time. And he said, the foundation is set. It's going to be really hard to make this roster now. Who are we looking at as guys who maybe on the first 2 seasons with Ryan Poles would be locks on the team simply because we just don't have the amount of talent that now could be a cut candidate? You mentioned Dominique Robinson. fans talk about Velus Jones, who I think personally, I think he's secure as far as kick return. The D back room is pretty deep. You want to be deep there, of course. Is there anybody that we're looking at and saying, hey, like, get it together? You might not make this team come week one.
I mean, that's a really good question. I'd say it's tough too, because to me, this team doesn't have, you know, the depth that I think a lot of people are under the assumption that it does. I mean, realistically, some guys you're looking at as cut candidates. Well, I could certainly go ahead and see a guy like, what's his name? Uh yeah, Larry Bourne going
Larry
ahead and
Borum,
being
yeah,
yeah, Larry Bourne being a guy that could certainly be a cut candidate. You start to kind of look at the whole thing and you start to kind of say, okay, what are you doing with a guy like Tyson Bagent? Like, yes, Tyson Bagent's a guy that you went ahead and you signed, had him play backup QB, but I don't know if he's gonna, make this roster with Austin Reed and Brett Wright being. I also look at, Doug Kramer being a potential cut candidate. Then you
yeah,
go ahead and you look at Dante Pettis. I know the Bears ended up bringing back Nasimba Webster, who's had no role over the last 2 years. He's probably going to end up being a cut candidate. And then you start to look at the defensive side of the ball and you're like, okay, well, Khalid Kareem could be a guy that ends up being a cut candidate. I look at Micah Baskerville, even, who's kind of been here the last, 2 years. Elijah Hicks
yeah,
as well, being a guy that I don't
yeah.
think, is certainly a rock to go ahead, or a lock to make this roster. Greg Stroman Jr. is another one that I say, okay, yeah, you've had some sort of preseason success, but again, we're not really sure, where you fit with this whole thing, especially in such a deep cornerback room now. And so it's
Right.
just really, this entire situation where there's 3 or 4 guys that I pencil in and I say, okay, go ahead and say, let's cut these guys. But then ultimately, the depth isn't where it needs to be. So it's just a massive, I think, question.
Yeah, those are all pretty valid points. Larry Borum, a lot of people talk about Kiran Amagaji potentially making Larry Borum cut, but Kiran's injured. I think he's not even going to participate until camp. Hopefully, I really hope he's good to go for camp. Kind of speaking of injuries a little bit, maybe not a specific injury, but what are you hearing about Rome Odunze? Because it was kind of brushed off as something that was like, he just has tightness and it's just precautionary, no need to push in minicamp, which I totally understand. But then in the back of my mind is, I remember last OTAs, Chase Claypool missed one and everyone was like, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just OTAs. He has plenty of time to heal. And he ended up missing a chunk of camp. So is Rome's hamstring tightness anything to worry about, or is that truly just precautionary?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both, right? You don't need to worry about it. I think it's the Bears just more so being, precautionary, because the way that they're looking at this is, this rookie minicamp is just 7-on-7 football is pretty much what it is. Okay. It's football in the sense of, they're not going to go ahead and, yeah, they got helmets on and jersey and shorts and cleats and all that, but they're not going to go ahead. There's no like live hitting that takes place. I think the Bears are kind of looking at this. And again, this is a coaching staff that I will say has been much more kind of conservative when it comes to handling the injuries, simply because, there's days where you get up to Hallisall for training camp and guess what? There's guys there that probably should be practicing, but are hanging off onto the side, riding the bike or something. And
Mhm.
so it's just, one of those where I don't necessarily think it's a cause for concern. I think it's a situation where, the Bears kind of right now are saying, all right, let's play it safe. We want you to be fully ready for OTAs and mandatory mini camps, so we can kind of put you in a position where, you are ready to go ahead, and when OTAs and mandatory camp kick off, you are right there ready to go with DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, because that's really where the kind of, I look at it and I say the real learning process for Rome Odunze is going to kick in.
All right, yeah, that makes sense. Definitely, I don't like panicking too early, but whenever I do see specifically leg things pop up in wide receivers, it's something that's like, okay, that's something you do have to keep an eye on. But hopefully, like you mentioned, it's nothing to worry about. What's going on with Tyler Scott, man? Like a lot, he was 3 years in a row, Ryan Poles has drafted a wide receiver. First this year, first time it's top 10, so it's a premium wide receiver finally. But is Tyler Scott going to get lost in the sauce, or do the Bears believe that they potentially still have something in him? Like he's on a really cheap rookie contract, so I highly doubt he's going to be a cut candidate unless he just completely flops during camp for whatever reason. But is there a role for him on this team to actually develop as a wide receiver?
Yeah, I think absolutely there is a role for Tyler Scott. Now you look at him, he's whatever, like 5'10, 5'11. So he's
Mhm.
definitely smaller than a lot of these other wide receivers. But what makes Tyler Scott such a good player is his understanding of the run game. And you look at
Mhm.
him and you kind of say there's going to be instances where he's not going to catch the ball at all during the game. He's going to be a guy that's going to be a wide receiver for, and theoretically, I mean, let's be real with some of the bodies the Bears have, he should be wide receiver for, bearing something drastically terrible happening. But you look at where he's at, and the big thing with Tyler Scott is even though he's a smaller wide receiver, he is still really tough. He's scrappy. Mentally, his understanding of the game is really sharp. And you look at kind of some of the things he did last year in the Luke Getsy offense, and it was something so simple as, hey, you're going to go ahead, you are going to go motion from one side of the formation to the other. And then what's going to happen is as you are in motion, the ball is snapped, and because this is a running play, it was Tyler Scott basically finding the either front side linebacker or the cornerback to be able to go ahead and take on. He's a player that's not afraid to, like, he fits the Bears brand of style on offense, the Bears brand of football on offense. And it's because he's not afraid to, be powerful at the point of attack and really deliver a powerful hit to pave the way for, a rusher. So he's a guy that is for sure going to have a role on this team. Just what it's going to be is going to be a big question. Maybe there's a situation where Tyler Scott pops off to the point where the Bears say in 2025, hey, we feel good about the three receivers we have. We may not need to bring back Keenan Allen because we're going to get Tyler Scott on a vastly cheaper deal.
That's best case scenario in my opinion. Tyler Scott last training camp, people said that he was looking even faster than Velus, and they're faster than all of the big three. So if we can develop that blazer, that would be pretty awesome. So moving into a kind of funner question here. Who are your rising candidates? Last year, I thought Kyler Gordon was going to pop off. He had that injury early on. Obviously, the plethora of offensive weapons. What guys are you looking for to take that next step for the Bears?
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of guys, right? And
Yeah.
again, part of it is this because of where they're at in their careers. The other half of it is just, the strong pipeline of talent that's expected to be in the 2025 draft. Because again, everybody's replaceable in this league. And the first guy that I'm looking at ultimately is Braxton Jones. You look at him and you say, okay, you're going into year 3. You've been above average the last 2 years. You
Mhm.
really haven't allowed a lot of sacks. Now, the question is, can you take that step from being, good to really essentially being great to hopefully one day being elite? Braxton Jones is the first guy that I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep an eye on. You look at Darnell Wright and you certainly say, okay, he was a guy last year that popped off massively. And again, for those of you guys that have followed me on Twitter, I mean, Darnell Wright's been on my radar since I want to say November, December 2022. And obviously there's a lot of Bears fans who are like, well, he doesn't fit the scheme. He's too big, but found a way to fit it last year. So Darnell Wright's another guy that I'm certainly keeping a massive eye on. You look at Javon Dexter and you kind of say, okay, played solid last year as a run stuffer. Kind of what can he do this year? I thought Tyreek Stevenson was easily the Bears' most underrated rookie last year and perhaps the most underrated player on defense. The thing with Tyreek Stevenson is you look at him in person and you see why the guy is a cornerback because he's incredibly long, he's lanky, he kind of knows how to go ahead and move. He is able to go ahead and play man and zone, switch it up instantly. And then he's incredibly confident and very instinctual, which are just two traits that you can't necessarily go ahead and coach. I look at the linebacker room and I say, hey, is there a shot that, we potentially see Jack Sanborn being ready for a year 3 breakout? So it's just really a situation where, the Bears have a handful of guys that can certainly go ahead and impact the game at any moment. Handful of young guys too. The one wild card to me, though, that I will say is going to be Roschon Johnson, because you have Khalil Herbert, who
Like that.
is not going to be back in 2025.
Right.
DeAndre Swift's going to be your bell cow feature back. Well, then the opportunity there is for Roschon Johnson to become the RB2.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree on Roschon Johnson. I'm excited to see what he can do. I've heard that teams, not sure how true it is, but I've heard the Bengals kind of reached out about Khalil Herbert, but the Bears aren't really interested in moving him. You definitely need depth in the running back room. I would love to see a Gervon Dexter pop. I think if Gervon Dexter breaks out, that's just going to revolutionize the defensive line. So just to kind of wrap things up, quick, another fun question. What was your favorite moment during the draft process? Because you were in Hallis Hall, you were around during the most exciting draft in Chicago, arguably in Chicago Bears modern history, at least. What was your favorite moment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say this, right? And it's weird because I've kind of, worked in media and journalism for 7 to 8 years now, dating back to 2017. And it's, certainly you kind of remember where you were during a lot of the big moments. But I would say kind of the coolest part was rolling up to Hallis Hall on a Friday afternoon around, I want to say 3:45, when that press conference was gonna get ready to start at 4 o'clock, and it's kind of been raining all day, but kind of being in the same room, seeing Williams and Rome Odunze introduced was pretty cool in my opinion. I think that, there's also from I know, for a lot of fans listening to this, you guys kind of rag on the media sometimes and say, well, the media this, the media that. But I also think that, just being in the media room too, kind of having the camaraderie with guys and people that cover, the Bears for other outlets is always, I want to say, the most fun part of it. And then just being around some of the people at Hallis Hall too. There's, I think, two things, right? There's, I think, the football side of it, but then there's also kind of the human element side of it. And that human element gets so forgotten sometimes to the casual viewer, just in the sense of you look at, someone like an Austin Booker, someone like a Torrey Taylor, Rome Odunze, Caleb Williams, and you say, okay, there is the football player that we see in them, but then there's also the player of, hey, it's so cool to see someone actually get a chance to realize their dream. And because they're up there speaking with the media for the first time, well, you are effectively going ahead and kind of helping them, realize that dream too, which is
Yeah.
always fun as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know that's got to be really cool to actually be in the room with all of these exciting players that everyone was talking about. But I greatly appreciate your time. I appreciate you hopping on here. Definitely want to have you on here again. I'm gonna wrap this one up, guys. If you feel free to go ahead and click on one of my previous videos, and I'll catch y'all there. Got anything else to say before we take off?
Oh yeah, just follow me on Twitter at Usaid Koshal. I'm pretty much plugged into everything that's going on at Alice all year round, and always down to talk, any sort of football.
Awesome.